Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm so thrilled to be a part of the Greater Reset activation. It is such an honor to be here. So, my talk this evening is entitled Designing a Family Culture of Consent. But wait, if you're not a parent, I do invite you to stay because we all are members of a family. We're sons, we're daughters, we're brothers and sisters, and we are also partners in interpersonal relationships as well as members within the community. But tonight I'm going to frame the conversation within the lens of a family. But you can apply these principles to wherever you are in your life. So, before I talk about consent, it's really important to talk about sovereignty first. In order to give consent, one must be a sovereign individual. And although intellectually most of us can understand that being a sovereign individual means having control over the domain of self. And most of the time that we talk about sovereignty over self, we're talking about sovereignty over body. But for the framework of this conversation, I'm going to ask you to consider sovereignty over thought. And I'm going to explain, I'm going to break this down into three different domains of sovereignty, which apply to not only this talk, but all of the talks that you'll find within the Greater Reset activation. So, sovereignty over thought, that sounds pretty intuitive. However, I'm going to suggest that you take a look at the manner in which you were raised or the culture in which you grew up in, or the way that you seeded your understanding of the world around you. And the majority of us were raised within authoritarian paradigms, whether it's government, culture, the rules and laws that remain around us, the systems that we function within, whether it's school, work, or health. These are all systems that have a set of rules that generally require us to follow that. And many of us were raised in authoritarian paradigms within our own childhood experiences as well. Now, we do know from a very simplistic brain development model that the world around us is modeled based on our perception. From 0 to 3, we're writing the code, we're writing the software as to how we interact with the world around us. And the majority of us have this stimulus of authority and rules set into place. And so when we step into greater sovereignty over self, we need to repattern some of that thinking. So when I'm talking about sovereignty over self, I'm really talking about sovereignty over thought and overcoming the habitual thinking which is part of most of our software. And so just consider that for a moment. Sovereignty over self obviously does include the physical body as well, but I just want you to include your thoughts. Within the framework of the system of education, we have a word for this. We call it deschooling, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that a little bit later into this conversation. But for now, just recognize that sovereignty over thought requires us to go within and recognize when those triggers or judgment or ideas that require us to follow what most of the time ends up being arbitrary rules are without questioning authority or questioning thought or questioning self. That means we're still in a state of needing to create the sovereignty within self. And this is where we start within relationships, which leads me to the second domain of sovereignty. Sovereignty over self is what I just described, but sovereignty within relationships, honoring those we are in relationship with, and understanding the nuances of interpersonal relationships and the role that sovereignty and consent play within this paradigm. So, this falls within the domain of parent child relationship, interpersonal romantic relationships, community, family, extended family, and our role in the greater world. So, that is also something that we're going to talk about today when we are talking about consent within the family dynamics. The third domain of sovereignty that we're not going to spend too much time on today in my talk, other than within the system of education, is sovereignty within systems. How do we interact and choose systems that we're going to be a part of? And many of the talks within the Greater Reset are addressing these particular systems. I know that there are talks about systems of land management and systems of creating community and systems of economics. And for this particular talk, we're not going there. But I understand in the greater scope of things, all three of these domains must be part of our relationship to sovereignty and consent. Why is this relevant? I would argue that it is of the utmost relevant to balance both the internal worlds and the external worlds at the same time. Change comes from within. Change and empowerment come from within. If we adapt a system and apply it to self and we are not empowered to change, then no matter how great the system is, it is not going to work. It's working against our internal software. So I would argue that keeping all three of these domains, the domain of self, domain within relationship, and the domain within the systems of the external world, in balance. And to me, I think that's really important. During my talk, I'm going to primarily be focusing on the first and the second domains. And it is my belief that it is our responsibility here and now to heal our ancestral wounds of a history of authoritarian paradigms and recognizing that this is no longer serving us, and start creating family structures that are based on partnership. So, before we get started, I'd love to give you a brief intro as to who I am. First of all, my name is Lainey Liberty, and I am an author, a speaker. I am an alternative education activist. I am often credited with spearheading the growing and thriving world schooling movement, world schooling being a form of alternative education that combines the world around us as a rich environment to learn from, often including immersive travel, experiential learning, and social learning as part of it. I am somebody who has facilitated over 50 teen retreats around the world over the last 8 years, living in community with dozens of teens a month at a time in different countries, facilitating cultural learning as a way to create conversation and dialogue about the outer worlds, as a way to really examine what's happening in the inner worlds. I'm also an adolescent development specialist, a teen mentor, and coach. And I've also co-founded a partnership parenting course. But to date, my greatest accomplishment is that of being a mom. I am a single mom to a now 21-year-old global citizen who is thriving and feels comfortable in his own skin and who has achieved a sovereign attitude about self and the world around. I can say to you with full confidence that freedom and liberty are absolutely possible, and it starts from within. All right, guys, so let's get started. I'm really excited to get into the meat and potatoes of designing a family culture. I'm going to go ahead and give you 4 steps to create your family culture. Now, this is taken from a workshop that I've given dozens of times around the world for hundreds of families, and generally the workshop itself takes several hours, but I am going to give you the highlights here that you could take these ideas and run with them. My recommendation for you would be, don't make decisions outside of your family, do it as a family. And in fact, that brings me to step number 1. Your first job is, as a family, to decide on the family governance, right? So there are many types of governance. There is an authoritarian paradigm, right, where somebody makes the rules and all people listen to them. Everybody within that family structure listens to them. There is a democratic model, which is where majority rules and somebody's voice is not getting heard in some instances. There's a sociocracy, and I know that there's a talk about sociocracy later on in the Greater Reset, and this is closer to kind of what I propose that most families adapt. Sociocracy does have its own specific ideologies, which I think is a really great way to govern communities. But the governance that I recommend the most is partnership paradigm. And within a partnership paradigm, decision making then becomes based on consensus. And the funny thing is, I've heard Derek before talk about how consensus is not his favorite manner in which decision making is made. And I get that. I get that for large groups of people. But my suggestion to you during the definition of the governance stage within your family culture is to strive for partnership and consensus, because having the practice of understanding that each of us as sovereign individuals has needs, desires, and wishes, right? And all of those needs, desires, and wishes have a space, an equal space within the family governance, that no one's vote weighs more than anybody else's vote. It creates a culture that it's necessary to practice compassion, cooperation, collaboration, and all of these soft skills that we're talking about should be practiced within the safety of a family dynamic. Now, I'll tell you, as a single mom to a single child, okay, so we know what the partnership paradigm looks like within the dynamics of 2 people. But I'll tell you, I mentioned before that I've facilitated teen retreats with anywhere between 8 and 18 teenagers living together in community for 1 month without a break, right? We function those retreats in those communities on consensus as well. And I'll tell you, it is possible to get a group of 18 teenagers that all have different perspectives and different points of view, understanding and starting to think about the culture of the community that they are co-creating. And that's a powerful act of empowerment that most, in my experience, teenagers and those that come from authoritarian families have never had the experience doing. So it's worth it. It's worth taking the time within the family structure. Again, I'm looking at healing generations and ancestral traumas of authoritarian paradigm that has really destroyed who we are as sovereign beings. So take the time. So number one, as I said, is governance. Let's move on to number two. In designing a family culture of consent, number two is centered around values. So part of the conversation with values is ditching rules. Instead of creating a family that has guidelines, rules, regulations that to many may be perceived as arbitrary, ditch them. And I know your immediate reaction is Lainey advocating creating a family of chaos? Well, I'm not. I'm not. There's a difference. We're not going to talk a whole lot about education, but I'm going to bring this into focus through the lens of education. When a child is forced to go to school, they are told from the outside what to learn. And that motivation to learn a particular thing is an extrinsic motivation. It's an outside motivation that's given to the child that is reinforcing an authoritarian paradigm, right? When you take a child out of a system that is authoritarian and you put them into an empowerment situation, especially in the framework of learning, self-directed learning comes from within. We're talking about intrinsically motivated children. This is how I raised my child without the framework of school, and he's a highly educated individual because of it, because of his passions and his interests, and all that came from within. I never forced him to study a particular topic or look at a particular thing. He was always empowered and facilitated to learn. Well, the same goes with rules, right? So if we are a family and our family rule is no eating at the couch, that to me sounds like an outside or an extrinsically motivated rule. Why is it there? Well, it may serve one person's desire or needs within the family structure. But if we're going back to the partnership paradigm within the family, nobody's one desire usurps or outweighs another member's desire. So how do we function within a family unit and not produce chaos? Well, I'll tell you how. We create a family of values, and instead of functioning based on rules that sit with outside of ourselves, we become a family based on our core values. Now, core values need to be decided upon from every member of the family. So if we together work together to co-create our family values, then when a decision comes up, we can see whether or not that this act or decision or activity is in alignment with our core family values, thus creating a greater family culture of values defined by you, defined from internally. So what I can tell you is rules are not needed, that values then replace the role of rules in your family's life. And yeah, sometimes it gets messy, and sometimes we mess up, and sometimes we make mistakes. But instead of punishing based on breaking the rules, which, by the way, when you've got rules, a rules based family culture, somebody then needs to be the rule maker, the rule enforcer, and then if the rule is broken, the rule punisher. And that to me doesn't sound like it's functioning within a partnership paradigm. Okay, so this brings me to step number 3 of designing a family culture of consent. For the third step, my recommendation is to design a culture that contains traditions and rituals. And the traditions and rituals will be as unique as your individual family. Now, you can draw upon the traditions and rituals that are within your culture, and I think that's a great idea and a great place to start. But I'm not just talking about that. I'm talking about committing to designing traditions and rituals within your family that you can practice on a daily basis, that you can practice on a weekly basis, a monthly basis, and any other time period that serves your family. So, things that are practiced on a daily basis could be as simple as having a meal together, right? That could be the source of a family tradition or part of your rituals. It could be reading a bedtime story together. It doesn't have to be grand and it doesn't have to be fancy, but what it does have to contain is the input from the whole family. And by again turning the empowerment to the family to be the co-creators of that thing that you do brings in more of a full buy-in. So I'm going to give you some examples of rituals and traditions and some of the things that my son and I did as we traveled. One of them was our nightly check-in. So every single night we would get together regardless of the time. We did not go to sleep until we did our evening or nightly check-in. And for us, it contained two main things and then a sort of communication element. So the first part of our family ritual was coming together. We created our sacred space. We called it our check-in, right? And we started off with these two questions. The first question was, what worked today? And that gives us the opportunity to communicate and share, even if our days were separate, right? If there were some days where we spent in the house and my son did one thing, I did another thing. There were days that we were out together. We knew what each other were doing, but it gave us the permission to come together and do that check-in. What worked today? Not only was it a review of the day, but it allowed us to put into the framework as to the things that were positive and were working for us. So the reflection, sometimes there were things that were commented on that I didn't know happened. There were things that I brought up that he had no idea were a part of my reality, and it was just a really wonderful way to share and come together. The second question that we asked after what worked today was, what didn't work today? And that is just as powerful of a communication to let the person know without complaint, here's what happened and this was my perception of the thing and it just didn't work for me. And the framing of it not working is a lot different than you did this, right? So we practice this way of communicating, and it really allowed us to drop the triggers and the defenses, which is part of claiming, one of the tools that we used in part of claiming our own personal sovereignty, right? in order to be free of triggers and pre-programming, to be able to be in dialogue and really hear what the other people in our family, or in our case, what the other person was saying. So those are the first two parts. And then the third part of our family ritual in our evening check-in was sharing what we wanted for the next day, what we had planned, communicating anything of importance, like, Mom, don't wake me up because I plan on staying up late tonight, so eat breakfast or lunch without me, don't worry about me. That kind of communication made it a very intentional communication about what the expectations of going into the next day were. And let me tell you, this kind of commitment in our family ritual to communication really set the groundwork for us really being accountable and responsible for ourselves. A lot of other types of family rituals and traditions came into play, and like we had monthly themes about cultural dinners. We had all sorts of, different things that we would do for each other, which became just sort of involved and enveloped into our tradition. Some just happened, right? Like, playing jokes on one another during our birthdays. Like, we knew that these things were coming up because it became a ritualistic part of what our culture involved. And that just really made the engagement and being part of that family, our family, your family, very, very special. And I think sometimes you may already be practicing family culture and family traditions, but coming together and putting words to the things that you're doing and creating the intentionality behind it gives it greater power and meaning within the culture of consent of your family. So that's number 3. So number 4, the fourth step of creating a family culture of consent is simply committing to practicing and trying on monthly themes. Okay, so what is that, you may be asking? Well, as somebody who lived location independent and part of our life was traveling, one of the incredible themes that our lifestyle allowed us to practice was the practice of saying yes. So for us, opportunities, inspirations, desires, questions, saying yes became one of those themes that we circled back around to quite a bit during our family. That was one of the reoccurring themes. But some of the other themes that circulated and were dominant in our family culture were questioning everything. And that came into play very intentionally during some of the investigations of history, some of the investigations of the cultural explorations we were doing both outside and inside our house. Questioning everything, like each other. Why? Why are you doing that? And you would think that by suggesting this as one of the themes for the month, you'd go running in the opposite direction. But it's absolutely empowering to be able to answer why it is that you're doing a certain thing in your life in that moment, and to be accountable and to have the dialogue around it. And just as it is empowering for you to share those things, it's just as empowering to facilitate your child to do this self-inquiry to figure out why they're doing a certain thing. So for us, that was one of our favorite things, which is question everything. And from the outer worlds to the inner worlds, it's an incredible skill to have. Sometimes themes can be centered around learning. It could be centered around storytelling. We're going to do a month of storytelling. It could be centered around loyalty. It could be centered around any particular thing that you wish to explore as a family intentionally. And in my workshops, obviously, we workshop lots and brainstorm lots of different ways to bring these into focus, but use your imagination. The thing that I would say to you is there are no rules. There are no rules on how to design and define a family culture of consent other than coming together as a family and to feel empowered. So, that's it for me. I am clearly out of time here. I'm going to leave with you my contact information. If I can support you in getting out of the school system and adapting a more self-directed path and moving into an unschooling, world schooling, and even radical unschooling path, it is my honor to do so. If you have a teen who is struggling now with all of the changes happening around them and need some tools to help set them on their path, that's the work that I do as well. So if I can be of service to you in any way, please do contact me at the contact information here. It's been a true honor to be a part of the Greater Reset. Blessings to you and your families. Thank you.